Ciao friends! In this video I want to introduce how to customize a date template in Bravo for Power BI. A date template is a set of JSON files that we will modify with Visual Studio Code with a preview of the data that we obtain from the template. In order to be able to use this tool, you have to know a little bit of JSON. You have to be able to read the documentation of the DAX template library. And of course, you have to watch this video and see how to write the DAX code that will be assembled into a customized date table for your models. So let's go to my desktop and see how it works. In Bravo for Power BI, we have in the Options dialog box a Templates pane where we can create new templates. Bravo for Power BI already has templates available, and when we create a new template, we have to start copying an existing one. In this case, we start from the weekly one and we create a new template called tutorial. So when I click create, what happens? You see that I have to specify a folder. In this folder, a new folder with the same name of the template will be generated. So if I select a C demo as a folder, what happens is that now I have Visual Studio Code open that shows me the content of the folder that I chose. And if I go to the Explorer window, you see that in C demo, you see that this is the folder C demo. Let's see if I can enlarge this. In my PC, I have this new tutorial folder that has actually the same content you can see in this area, in this pane. So we're going to use just Visual Studio Code to edit the content of this folder. But remember, the entire folder contains, let's say, the source code and the output that is generated by Visual Studio Code. But before moving forward, it's important to make sure that you installed the Bravo template editor in Visual Studio Code. If you didn't do that, go in the extensions pane and download and install the Bravo template editor, as we also shown in another video that introduces how to use the templates. The goal for this video is just to focus on how to use the template. But as you see, in order to use the template, first of all, I have to connect Visual Studio Code and this template editor to a running instance of Power BI. In this case, I have just an empty model. You can connect to any model that has imported data or even just a calculated table, because we need the analysis services engine to execute the code to generate the preview of the data. When this is available, you will see here the model changes preview that we will see in a minute. Now, let's go back to our structure. So this is the content we have in the folder tutorial, but actually our goal is to generate this tutorial package.json file. This is the template. This is the file that you can copy by email or with a USB key to another PC, and you can consume, you can use that template. Now, this version of the file is a template that can be only used but cannot be edited. If you want to edit the same template in another computer, you will have to go back to your storage, in this case to my folder demo. I have to copy the entire folder tutorial and I have to move this folder to another PC. And this way I have the entire content of the template, including the source files that are those that are required to author the template. Otherwise, you can only consume it. So once we specified what is the role of this folder, let's focus on the files that we have in this folder, src or source. We say usually source folder. Now you see that we have 5 files that have different names. Now we could be free to generate files with the name that we want, but because we created the template by copying an existing one, we basically inherited the name of the files we had in the original template. We can change everything if you want, but this is the description of how these files work. Now, the first file we have to look at is this config file, because this config file is like the high-level configuration file that has the instruction about all the modules we want to include in the template. How can we know what is the structure of this file, what is the content, where is the documentation of these files? Luckily, we have this documentation. Let's go to this website. You see that in docs.sqlbi.com, we have the documentation for several tools from SQL BI, and there is an entire section dedicated to DAX template. Now, you were using Browser for Power BI. Browser for Power BI has a manage dates section, a manage dates feature that consumes date templates. A date template is just a particular type of a generic DAX template. DAX template is a library that can generate DAX code, DAX tables, DAX columns based on JSON definitions. It's very generic, it can do many things. Browser for Power BI uses a subset of these features to generate date tables for your model. Not to generate. So this is the documentation that basically specifies how to start from scratch from an empty file. I suggest that you look at this documentation step by step to have a deeper understanding of this. And there is a description of the standard templates we provide for the calendar, for the date table too. Now, the configuration that we were looking at is this file. So this is the section of the documentation that explains in details what we have in the config file. And basically the config file has, let's go back to Visual Studio Code, has a number of templates that we want to include. So I copied the weekly template, which includes a generation of the holidays for the calendar, a table with the definition of the calendar, and also a template to generate time intelligence measures based on the date table. So you see that there is a set of templates that is used, and basically each entry in this JSON file specifies which template we want to use from which file and so on. So I will not go in the details, but the idea is that this is the index we specify to say, okay, we want to use all these other JSON files. In particular, we have this date template file that generates the date table, this holidays definition that generates the definition of the holidays that is used to generate a holidays table that is used to populate the holidays column in the date table, and finally, the time intelligence JSON file, which is the template that generates the time intelligence measures for your model. So this is the high-level overview of these files. Now, before looking at the content of these files, let's see what happens when we have the Bravo template editor available. Now, the Bravo template editor can actually read these files and prepare a preview of the result of these files combined when they will be applied to a model using Bravo for Power BI. And this is the role of this model changes preview. You see that we have two areas: dates, which is a list of tables that are generated by the template, and time intelligence, which is the list of the measures that are generated thanks to this template. In this case, let's start from the tables. You see that we have, in the date table, we have a number of columns and hierarchies that are created automatically. The same for date auto template, the same for holidays, and so on. Now, you notice that I didn't click on the name of the table so far. I just clicked on the expansion icon that we have in this place. But what happens when I click the date table? You see that two things happen at this point. You see that we have the date definition, so the DAX code that defines the object that is generated by the template, and on the right you see the preview of the content of this table. Now actually I'm looking at the preview because previously I already opened the preview. The first time you open you click on a table, you see the DAX code that generates this table, so the DAX code that is injected into the calculated table in the model. But you can click on this button and you can see the preview of the result that is obtained by executing this code, which is very useful because we can see starting from our JSON file, what is the DAX code generated and what is the content generated for that DAX code, all together in the same window of Visual Studio Code. Now, usually when we want to work with these files, what we want to do is to be able to see all at once the JSON file, the DAX code, and the content. So I had to arrange my code. So let's start moving the preview. I think that the best thing is to keep the preview data at the bottom, so we can lower this, and then we can go back to the list of the files. And for example, let's start clicking on the template. So this is the JSON file we want to modify, and based on the changes that we will apply here on the right, we want to see the preview of the data. So remember that the preview is always activated in the active pane. So if I have the focus on this pane, I can click on date, for example, and I can see the definition of the DAX code for the object I selected. Now you see that date is just a single expression that points to date auto template. So the more interesting code is here. The result that you see in the preview is identical for the two tables. And now this is how I want to work. So I can close this one at this point. And the idea is that whenever I make a change in this window, I will see that this code and this pane, the lower area of Visual Studio Code will be updated according to the changes I make to my definition. So, of course, this doesn't happen as soon as you type something, but when you save the file. Whenever I save a new version of this JSON file, I will see that this will affect the other files. So let's go back to the Explorer in this area, and let's put the focus here. And for example, when you double click, you pin this file in this pane, so that if I move to another file, you see that the new file is created side by side. The two files I want to see side by side are these two, the config file and the date template file. Why am I doing this? Because, for example, you see that in the config file, we have the default parameter, the defaults that are input that you can provide in Bravo for Power BI for a template. And because we don't have that user interface, if I want to see the data for a different range of, I want to simulate what happens when I change a parameter, this is the area you want to change, the default variables for this template. For example, in this case, I see that I have, well, not the default variable. I want to change the first year and the last year. So, for example, I see that now I'm starting from 2021. I could say I want to start from 2020. So I modify these two values, 2020 in the first year min and first year max, and I save this file. Now, because when I save this file, I update these two other files, you see that this immediately changed the definition. And actually, I have 2018. This is strange. I have to check why this is happening. Probably because this moves the date to 2019. Oh, for the fiscal year, I have April. So let's start from January. That's side effects of the changes that you can apply. Could be complex. So whenever I want to save, I press Ctrl S, but of course you can go File and Save. You don't see me doing this because I simply use Ctrl S on my keyboard. And you see that now I start from 2020, January 2020. So far, so good. So this is not an area that you modify often. And if you want to know the meaning of each of these settings that are more detailed than those that you can just see in the Bravo for Power BI user interface, again, you go to the documentation, in configuration, we have a number of information. Oops, I used probably a wrong link. We have to fix this link, but in this config object, you can see all the details that we have in the settings that I was modifying. And for example, before I modified first year min, first year max, and this is the description of the meaning of these elements. Now let's go back to this configuration. So I will not change this much later, but now I want to focus on the date template, because here is where I can make most of the changes. And in order to explain how this works, I want to give you a high-level overview of the structure of this file. So you see that this file has basically 4 sections, actually 5, which are steps, global variables, row variables, columns, hierarchies. And it's easier if we start from the bottom. At the bottom, we have the hierarchies that are created. These are the hierarchies that will be created in the table that combine different columns of the table in a user hierarchy. We can see these hierarchies just going in, for example, date. You scroll down and you see that we have year, month, week that has these levels. We have year, quarter, month, week that has these levels, and so on. So this is the only way you can see the hierarchy in Visual Studio Code. Then we have, so this is pretty easy. Then we have the columns. Columns is the list of the columns that we want to generate for the table. So basically, we have a list of columns that will be generated, and as you see, the first one is date. Now, you notice that we have actually a few columns. These start of year, end of year, year number. These are columns that are marked as temporary, which means that they are created during the preparation of the table. They can be consumed by other columns of the same table, but they will be removed from the table that is actually stored into the model. So this is one of the many techniques that we use to create complex expression, because as I will show you in a moment, in order to define the business logic for each column, we work in a way similar to how we define calculated columns in Power BI, for example, but we don't have a model. We have to work with the other elements we build in a separate way in different columns. So in other words, in order to create a column, we might want to reference another column, and this could create a number of problems in terms of determining the order of the evaluation. So we use variables, we use row variables, global variables, or temporary columns. These are the several techniques that we can use. So let's move forward. So for each column, we have a name, a data type that defines what is the data type of the column, and we have other information that I will explain in a moment. So let's get a simple column like the fiscal year. The fiscal year is defined with an expression. What is this expression? This is exactly the DAX code that defines the content of this column. At the moment, this DAX code simply references a name, _ fiscal year, which means, imagine you write a calculated column in Power BI and you write name of the column, fiscal year, equal _ fiscal year. This is what is happening. And if we look at the code, if we look at fiscal year, if we go to the bottom, fiscal year is actually defined referencing fiscal year. Fiscal year is defined before, let's see if I can find it. It is defined before in this point, and it is assigned to the variable fiscal year. So you see that the code generated is split into several steps for technical reasons that we might see later. But the idea is that I'm just defining the simplest possible expression that references a variable. And where is this variable? Well, you see that we have, before columns, we have another section that is called row variables and another section that is called global variables. As you can imagine, A row variable is a variable defined for each row, so the value changes for each row of the table, whereas a global variable is a variable that is assigned once for the entire table and is not going to change for every row of the table. So if we open the row variables, we see that the fiscal year definition has been defined in DAX using this code. So let's enlarge this pane so we can see the code. So we use the format, fiscal year number, which is another variable, and we have in the second argument of format, we have this special string that is creating a string that is also using a special getISO function that has this double at prefix that identifies a special, let's say, macro we have available in the template. Where can we find the function we have available for our template? Once again, in the documentation. Just have to remember DAX placeholders. These are, we call them DAX placeholders. These are special placeholders you can write in the DAX code that will be replaced with something else. In our case, we use this getISO, which retrieves the ISO format that has been specified in the config object. If you remember, the config object is an object that has a number of definitions. A few of these definitions could be bound to parameters provided by the user in Bravo for Power BI. And for example, if you choose the language that you want to use, the culture that you want to use for your date table, this information can be used to generate the name or the proper format of the year based on your local configuration. Now, probably for the year, this is not very useful, but imagine the same principle for the month name. You want to have the month name using a different language, we will use the same approach. So if I go back at this point, you can start to see a pattern here, which is I define the columns I want to obtain, and in each column I specify usually just a variable. Yes, you could specify the format function directly. You could specify DAX code directly, but it's a best practice to use variables, because this way, if the same content has to be used in different columns, you can simply reference the same variable multiple times. This simplify the code and allow you to not duplicating the code across your template. So we try to have a system where every column has a row variable that generates the number or the string that we need for that content. Now you can see that, for example, sometimes the calculation of the first day of the month, the first day of the quarter, it could be more complex. In this case, we have a weekly calendar, which has a complex configuration because it has to retrieve the first and the last day in the quarter. That could be in any month. You cannot base, for a weekly calendar, you cannot assume that the first day of the quarter is the first day of the month. You have to get the first Monday or the first Sunday in a particular set of 4 or 5 weeks. So the idea is that, first of all, let's create the weeks, let's assign the quarter. If I need a column that has the first day of the quarter, just iterate over all the rows that I already computed and find the first or the last one within the current quarter. That could be the idea. And this is exactly what we do in this technique. And this, I explained this technique because I wanted to introduce the need for creating and separating the calculation in different steps. If you think for a moment, if I create a column and this column has to iterate the value that we define in another column, we need to prepare a table with the previous column. When this table, this temporary table is ready, we want to iterate this table and then we want to create an additional column, which means that in DAX terms, we have to create a first table and then we have to add columns to the previous table. So we create a table in a variable, then we add columns to the initial variable, creating a second variable with another table, and so on. But the idea is that by doing that, the new columns in the second step can reference the columns that we created in the first step. For this reason, we have this idea that we can split the calculation, the preparation of our date table into multiple steps. And this is the reason why we have a section steps which can create manual steps. Otherwise, the steps are created automatically by the engine that generates the template. So the template can generate all the steps that are required, step 1, 2, 3, 4, but we can create steps intentionally because we want to create tables that have a particular way of being calculated, and then we can reference these steps as steps that are part of the process of the calculation. So I suggest that you look at the code. I started from the more complex example just because I wanted to give you the more complex situation where we use all the features of the template. But to be honest, for many simple calendars, probably this is not required. You don't have to manually create all these steps. You will find that in simpler templates, you will find no steps at all, or just one that just create a list of dates, a column with the dates, and starting from there, you create all the other columns. So, in other words about the global variables, as I said, the global variables are variables that are global, and these variables could be configurable. What does it mean? If you want to open, so let's go to Bravo 1 second. When you go in Manage Dates, so let's connect Bravo to my model and go in Manage Dates. You see that when I select weekly, you see that weekly asks for a few parameters. Now, if you want your global variable to be included in the list of inputs that are asked to the user as parameters of the templates, you have to configure this setting is configurable to true. Of course, Bravo for Power BI doesn't support any global variable, only those that have the specific name that we support. But the idea is that because we create a new template starting from an existing one, it's up to you to decide whether you want to still provide this option to the user or you want to remove this option because we want to make it simpler to use. You want to define, okay, this is going to be always 0, always 1. I don't want the user to be able to change it. So you can tell to your users, just use this template. You don't have any option to click. You just select the template, go, and you have the right date table. That could be the idea for disabling the configurability of this. And other global variables are not configurable because, for example, we want to know the first transaction date, the last transaction date, which are obtained by using these other DAX placeholders, get min date, get max date. And if we take a look at the content generated for the first transaction date, so if I search for first transaction date, I think it's here. So first transaction date in this case is today. Now, why today? Because in this case, this was the definition of the underlying model. I use a model that doesn't have a table, so actually we are using a model that has no tables at all. But in a real model where you say, I want to scan all the existing tables, you will see a more complex expression that actually get the minimum value of all the date columns in all the date tables. So it's a longer expression that scans the selected tables or all the tables of your model, depending on the configuration you apply to the managed dates in Bravo for Power BI. So again, my suggestion is to take a look at the way the patterns have been defined. You will find that every expression is usually just 1 or 2 lines. We try to be very, very simple in the definition of each element, and it's up to the engine, the DAX template engine, to build the more complex DAX expression for the entire table, considering all the required dependencies, so the proper order of the variables is automatically generated by the engine. You can define the columns and the variables in any order. The dependencies will be arranged automatically by the library. So this is very good. Now, this is the way you define the main table. You see that we have a holidays and holidays definition table. And actually, the table that we actually define is this holidays definition, which usually we don't change. We just consume what we have, and you can just provide a different content for the holidays definition table. So if you take a look at how this holidays definition file is defined, so if we go in holidays definition, you see that basically the content of the holidays definition is just a JSON file that has one record for each holiday configuration for each state. For example, for the United States, this is the definition of the New Year Day. And there are a number of parameters because what we define is the rule to generate the holiday over time. Again, in the documentation, you will find a description of the meaning of each of the parameters we have. We already have the holidays for many countries. The idea is that you might want to customize this file if you want to add, for example, countries for a local town, local city. You want to create a calendar that is customized for your company, for example, and you want to specify which holidays you want for your particular business. This generates two tables. One is the holidays definition table that, as you see in the preview, so let's go just here. This is the definition of the DAX definition of the holidays definition table, and this is the content that we have in the model. But the role for this table is only to populate a simpler table that is called holidays, which has just the date and the holiday name. Why we have this table? Because in the definition of the template, so let's go back to the date template, we have, when we define the column with the holiday name, let's see if we have the holiday name somewhere, here we go. Holiday name is defined using this expression, which is a variable, holiday name with a double underscore at the beginning. We go in underscore holiday name, and we have this specific placeholder get holiday name, providing the date as an argument. Now, if we look at this holiday name in the definition of the date table, so let's go in date auto template where we have the full definition. Let's see if I can find this first transaction of holiday name, holiday name. Here we go. You see that the get holiday name placeholder has been transformed into a lookup value that looks for the holiday name column in the holidays table where the holiday date is equal to date. So this is the idea. So this is the expression that transforms the current date for that row in the date table into a holiday name, if this exists. Otherwise, the result is blank. So this is just to show you step by step that every single step is a simple element combined in a more complex generation of the code here. So this, I think, is enough for the definition of the date table, which is something that you can customize in different ways. You can add columns, or you can simply remove columns that you don't need, for example. You could start from a template that has more columns that what you want, and you can just remove those that you don't want. Another thing we can customize is how we generate the measures in the model. So we have seen how to generate the date table. Now let's see how to generate the measures. So the measures are defined in this time intelligence JSON file, which has one name, one element. In this case, for example, we see the year to date, one element for each measure that has to be generated for the time intelligence function. So let's say that we want to compute the year to date and the year over year. You have two members, two definitions in the time intelligence JSON file, and these two definitions will be applied to all the measures that the user selects in Bravo for Power BI to get the time intelligence features. So, for example, in this case, we have the year-to-date is a multi-line expression. So sometimes we have to arrange the code a little bit for the JSON requirements, and this is what we have to create an expression that has multiple lines. You see that we have an array of different strings. And once again, we have a number of placeholders that we use to reference the measure that we want to create, that we want to customize, and other attributes that identify specific columns of the model that should have particular roles. So before looking at some example to explain you these elements, think about this. We already have many time intelligence functions defined. So if you need other time intelligence function, you can customize what you have now. You can add additional ones. But I suppose that the more common action will be to simply remove time intelligence function you don't want. We have tens of time intelligence functions, which means that whenever you apply these time intelligence functions to the model, you have many measures created into the model. Now, in this case, I got a model that doesn't have any measures. So let's open a model that has something more. And you see that now my model had 3 measures: margin, sales amount, total cost. And for each measure, we created all the variation, all the possible time intelligence calculations we define in this template. So let's say we don't want to see the quarter measures. So what we can do, we can identify those elements like quarter to date we want to remove. So we remove the quarter to date at this stage. We want to remove also the other quarter over quarter, year over year, previous quarter. So let's remove the previous quarter. Oops, we have to do this carefully without breaking the syntax, and also the quarter over quarter percentage. So I just removed 3 or 4 measures. You see that as soon as I save this file, save, you should see that here in the model changes preview, we will see that a few of these measures disappeared. So I think that this is the more common customization. And of course, for the remaining measure, we can see how these measures have been generated. Let's move the definition of the measures on this side so we can review what is going on. So let's say that we want to take a little bit more we want to take a look at how this is generated. You see that my code doesn't specify a specific column name of the model. In this case, we have date, fiscal year, number, but this is identified like this other special placeholder. So we have a number of rules to identify columns or tables in the model based on specific attributes that have been defined. This could be important for the translations because you might want to change the name of a column or translate the name of a column, and the template still has to work referencing the correct column. So what we do, we have a naming convention that is identified by these 2 placeholders at, and if I go back to the documentation, we can see that these placeholders are defined in this section measure templates. So we see that we can specify a column, we can specify a list of columns, a table or a list of table, or a measure folder, and so on. So all these placeholders can be used to identify a specific column, which is identified how? By using specific attributes. What does it mean? Let's take a look, for example, at this one. We want to get the attribute that correspond to the SQL BI attribute types that is called fiscal weeks. So if we go back to the definition of the template, we should see that there is a column where we define, so let's see if I can find fiscal weeks, which has this attribute type fiscal weeks. And let me check if I don't have another one. So this is annotation. So I think that is, yeah, the attribute type is automatically converted into a SQL BI attribute type, because these attribute types are extensions of the attributes that are used in the model. So you will find in the documentation that attribute type is used for different roles. In this particular case, for attribute type, we apply an attribute in the model, and this attribute is used to identify the column later. So when you translate the model, you can change the name of the column, but without changing the attribute type, the definition of the template for the time intelligence measures will still work, because it will identify the different column name or table name that you have in the model. You will see that this works not only for the column, a single column name, it could work for a list of columns. You might have multiple columns with the same attribute. Same for the table, single table, and list of the tables. Of course, we cannot see the result of the execution of a specific measure with the time intelligence function. We have to write this template into a model and try the measure into the model. Or you could use DAX Studio, copying the definition of the measure and try with some query. But the goal for the video was to introduce you to the definition of this template. And remember, once we save the file, the template is ready, because every time you save the file, the content of this package.json file is updated, and this is the final output of your template that you can share with other users. Now, remember that we can see the definition of the measure generated with the time intelligence. We cannot see the result of a measure, because in order to do that, we have to use the measure in a report or consume the measure in DAX Studio. But remember, we are only looking at the preview, so in order to test the template, we still have to go back to Bravo for Power BI. Once you save the template, you updated the package.json file that is the only one used by the manage dates function. For example, now we choose the tutorial template that we define, and this template now applies to the model when we preview changes and confirm the application. We have the new date table, the new measures, and we can test the result in our model. So we have seen that we can customize the date template in Bravo for Power BI. There is some work involved in studying the documentation for all the properties you can use. I hope that you have now a general idea about how the template is structured, what is the role of each file, what is each element doing in building the final template that you can use in your model. And the easiest way to start is to simply copy an existing template, start to change a small part, and see the result in your model, maybe just customizing an existing template with the specific parameters that you need for your company. I hope that you will enjoy the date template feature in Bravo for Power BI.